The International Festival of Arts and Ideas is created and produced on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac, in the land we all call home, Connecticut. We hope that from wherever you are, you take a moment to acknowledge and honor the native people whose land you are on and the history of the place you are in.
The International Festival of Arts and Ideas stands in solidarity with Black and Brown communities and other groups who are targeted and abused by unjust systems of oppression. We support all movements working to decenter white voices and dismantle white supremacy. We are actively seeking to dismantle systemic racism, and we raise our voices with those in our community who are already engaged in this vital work. We commit to working alongside you to create transformative change in New Haven and in our global community.
Hello, New Haven. How are you? Great. Hey, my name is Malachi Eason. I am the Director of Programming and Community Impact for the International Festival of Arts and Ideas. And I want to thank everyone for being here today and be able to experience this wonderful, wonderful talk we're about to have. So give yourselves a round of applause for being here. Before I get started, I would love to thank some of our partners that we have. First and foremost is Connecticut Humanities, who is one of our partners that made the Ideas program possible to ensure that we present dozens and dozens of talks just like this for free. Give them some respect and some love. Then our marquee sponsors, which is Community Foundation of Greater New Haven, Yale University, National Endowment for the Arts, Connecticut Office of the Arts, City of New Haven, and again, our friends of Connecticut Humanities. Some love. A quick reminder that tonight and tomorrow we are showing Parable of the Sower at the Schubert Theater. So if you have some time tonight or even tomorrow evening, go to artidea.org and purchase you a ticket. You just do not want to miss this one. It's going to be really, really good. And also our ideas topic is for tomorrow is the power of choice in climate change. And now I have the great pleasure to introduce the two people that we're having a conversation with today in our Ideas series. First is Alexa Miller of Arts Practica. She is the co-creator of Harvard Medical School's program Training the Eye, Improving the Art of Physical Diagnosis. She contributed to research on the impact of art on medical cognition and was the first ever non-MD to serve as a fellow for the Society to Improve Diagnosis in Medicine. She is published in numerous journals and textbooks and a teacher of a course on uncertainty at Brandeis University. Also, we have Dr. A.J. Eckert, the medical director of Eckert Health. He is the Connecticut's first out non-binary trans doctor and serves as the medical director of Eckert Health's Gender and Life-Affirming Medicine, GLAM, program. Dr. Eckert has over 15 years experience in LGBTQ healthcare, with 8 years as a provider of primary care and gender-affirming services. He is active in education and advocacy and works at making information about gender-affirming care accessible to trans people everywhere. Please put your hands together for Alexa and Dr. Eckert.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Malachi, and thank you to the organizers. I'm Alexa Miller, and I'm so thrilled and honored to chair our panel tonight on the topic of art and medical observation. Oh my goodness, I'm missing the slide advance. Oh, here it is. Thank you. Dr. Eckert and I are so thrilled to dive into this topic together and with all of you. So to begin, we just briefly wanted to talk about our topic in more detail, as it could actually mean a number of different things. So our panel tonight is on the simple and sacred act of seeing in medicine. For a clinician, simply to see patients is a central task in their work and really their core art, regardless of if their domain is pediatrics, internal medicine, radiology, oncology, or what have you. And for a patient to be accurately seen and heard in a healthcare landscape that puts more value on things like treatments, prescriptions, services, than it does on the time it takes to locate what is happening in and with a complex, unique human being. For a patient to be seen in this context is actually a major event in their journey, if not a small miracle. And for far too many, it's a rare occurrence. Excuse me. So the popularity of this meme on places like social media demonstrates what a rare occurrence that is. And, you know, I use this teaching a lot I use this meme a lot in my teaching with students. And as you might imagine, people have quite a bit to say about it. So many of us can relate to this figure here on the left, because so many of us have had experiences as patients where forces in healthcare were working counter to our health, to put it generously. But you know what, when you look at it, when you start to really get into it, nobody really wants to be in the position of the figure on the right either. And COVID has really lifted the veil on many of the legacy and systems issues and industry issues that put clinicians in a very difficult and sometimes failing position. In fact, we live in an era, I call it an epidemic of inaccuracy, and it's certainly not limited to healthcare. Although in healthcare we can see statistics that show in a really raking light what it costs us. Death resulting from medical misdiagnosis today is actually equivalent to a 747 jet airliner crashing every other day. And these numbers are disproportionately higher for women and people of color and marginalized populations. It's as if those airplanes are full of our sisters and aunts, our neighbors and our coworkers whose struggles shape their lives and largely go unrecognized by the predominant context. Medical misdiagnosis is deeply intersectional with structural violence. So in this context, this is the context why tonight on our panel we celebrate the simple and radical act of seeing in medicine, and we elevate the clinicians who do not let that toxicity and the challenges of the current landscape stop them from pursuing the mastery of really seeing their patients and really seeing their humanity and their complexity. And it's why also we highlight tonight the art of what that takes in practice, what it looks like, and in practice and also in teaching our future generations of clinicians. And when I say our future generations of our clinicians, it's because our clinicians, the men and women who make up the doctors, the nurses, the dentists, the therapists of our healthcare workforce, they really are a public good. We don't tend to think of them that way, but they are essential to our society's well-being, and their training matters so greatly. And so with that, our panel tonight is going to roll out in 3 parts. So first, Dr. Eckert is going to talk about their work as a leader in the space of gender-affirming healthcare. Following that, I'm going to share on diagnosis and how a couple of different ways that I use art to teach principles of diagnosis. And it's worth mentioning that Dr. Eckert and I are really getting to know each other in real time. We haven't met before tonight. And it's thanks to the vision of the festival organizers in particular Denise Santisteban, to bring us together tonight. So we will be, the third portion of our panel is a Q&A, so know that we'll be getting to know each other in real time and exploring the dovetails of this work. And then we will open it all up to you for questions for the last 15 minutes. And so without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Eckert. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if I should stand or sit for this. I guess I'll stand. Let me see. So Anchor Health is Connecticut's leading health center. We're focused on embracing and promoting the health and well-being of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and gender nonconforming individuals through compassionate, comprehensive, and evidence-based care in a safe, welcoming, and affirming space. We were established in 2016, and we see more than 2,500 patients across 2 full-service clinics, and over 50% of those are transgender and gender nonconforming. We do primary and preventive health care, gender and life-affirming medicine, or GLAM, HIV prevention and treatment, comprehensive STI testing, behavioral health care, and more. And I am Dr. Eckert. I use they, them, and he, him pronouns. Also on the slide, that is our mascot, Lupik. He is my medical assistant and, the office mascot. So when we talk about primary care, what we really focus on is patient-centered care. So we use patient satisfaction surveys to make sure we're always improving. When we do gender-affirming medicine with our patients, we don't have forms to sign to, quote-unquote, prove that you can start hormones. We constantly update the language of our forms for inclusivity and neutral language, and do that also with all the provider templates on a regular basis to stay up on the latest. We have case management services for all aspects of patient life, even outside of healthcare. So we actually have a new regular trans ID clinic with the New Haven Pride Center to help with name changes and gender marker changes. We now have a psych APRN also providing psychiatric care. And we pride ourselves on quick response times to our patients when they call or need refills or have questions. We pay a lot of attention to trauma-informed care and creating safe space. The bottom line goal of all of this is for us to increase the engagement of LGBTQ people in healthcare, decrease overall rates of morbidity, mortality, and discrimination and stigma. So more on the trauma-informed approach that we use, part of it is realizing the prevalence of trauma in our patients' lives and recognizing the impact that trauma has in our patients' lives and the community, and responding in ways that are informed by the understanding of that trauma and what's needed to support recovery and resilience. Part of that, too, is resisting engaging in practices that can potentially re-traumatize our patients. As far as safe space is a term that originated in gay and lesbian bars in the mid-1960s when anti-sodomy laws were still in effect. So it didn't mean that it was a space that was necessarily physically safe or safe from the cops, but it was safe in the sense that you could be out and in good company. When we talk about safe spaces today, we talk about refuges and places to relax. Because we know that emotional states of our patients are also physical states. Our mental well-being is shaped by our neural pathways, our digestive tracts, our muscular tensions, and our hormones such as cortisol, and having that be high all the time is associated with poor health outcomes. Nobody can constantly live in a state of vigilance, so the need for safe spaces is literally the need to not have your adrenal system constantly firing at full tilt. Really, part of creating safe spaces is creating spaces where we can be empathic and where we treat others with humility, respect, and compassion, and are willing to learn from our own mistakes. As part of that, we also approach our patients with cultural humility and sensitivity, and work on being open, non-judgmental, and receptive to learning about our patients' experiences. I have a lot of notes here, but I'll cut to. As far as our gender and life-affirming medicine program, it fills a need that falls short not only in Connecticut, but in many states. Our goal would be expanding what we do beyond Connecticut. And it can include things like helping people with changing their name and gender marker, helping them navigate other aspects of social transition, hormone therapy, surgery, etc. And we have comprehensive services for patients as young as 12 years old for primary care, and as young as when they start puberty for puberty blockers and different gender-affirming options. So, putting it just very clearly, we are healthcare for queer people by queer people. And this matters because it is important for us as queer people to take our power and voices back, to counter the cis and heteronormative medical narratives that are out there. LGBTQ people often don't talk to their doctors about their sexual orientation and or gender identity, and that happens probably a lot more than people realize because we don't want to get a negative response. And despite existing protections, we face disturbing rates of healthcare discrimination, from harassment and humiliation by providers to being turned away by hospitals, pharmacists, and doctors. This is incredibly important now, where in 2022 alone, 15 states have introduced a total of 25 bills intending to restrict access to gender-affirming care for trans children and adolescents. This would also mean, and part of that is also not teaching about LGBT history in schools and not teaching about any LGBT topics, removing books on gender identity, banning people from participating in sports teams. There are 140 bills that, if introduced, would deny medical care for gender transition and impose limits on bathroom use. Overall, there are more than 300 anti-LGBTQ bills that have been proposed in 2022. And some of them go so far as to want to criminalize gender-affirming care. So, for example, places like Alabama would make it a felony, punishable for up to 10 years in prison if a medical provider was found, quote unquote, guilty of prescribing gender-affirming blockers and hormones to anybody under 19. This means that, combined with all the legislative efforts out there, over 58,000 trans youth could potentially lose access to gender-affirming care, depending on how many of these bills become laws and in which states. So part of our mission is also education and outreach. We're on TikTok, we have Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and a website. We've actually recruited at least 20 new patients from TikTok. 60% of TikTok's US audience is between the ages of 18 and 24, and over 50% of Anchor Health's patient population is in that age range. The bottom line goal of all of this is to share resources, education, and provide hope to those who have no or limited access to gender-affirming services. It's really important for us to be out there combating misinformation and really showing that how important what we do is, because gender-affirming care is life-saving care. So when we talk about gender-affirming care, it is really important to also talk about about the efficacy of gender-affirming medicine, because it is incredibly efficacious in decreasing mental health outcomes such as depression and anxiety, and decreasing suicidal ideation and rates. It's safe. A lot of gender-affirming medicine, especially in the media now, is talked about as being experimental and dangerous, even though what we use to treat has been used for decades now. They'll say that because the medications are off-label, that they are experimental, and that's just not the case. That doesn't make a treatment experimental. And we use standards of care, and gender-affirming medicine really is the standard of care according to most of the major medical organizations out there. So there are those who seek to deny science-based medicine and seek to deny really gender-affirming treatment. Overall, the existing research base overwhelmingly supports an affirmative approach, and that's what we do at Anchor Health. And I know I'm talking a lot. I think we're almost there. So as far as the importance of also just LGBTQ voices and us being a queer space for and by queer people is to really elevate LGBTQ instructors and speakers, to envelop eventually formal training on LGBTQ communities throughout the medical curriculum. That's a project that we're currently working on. And include LGBTQ patients in clinical scenarios as part of case-based medical training for medical students. Right now, there's a lack of formal training, so most medical students get maybe an hour lecture, if anything, when talking about LGBTQ health, and that is just simply not enough to learn anything and to get any competency. So the goal is really to be integrated into the medical school curriculum as opposed to being othered into an hour-long lecture where everybody is lumped together. And that's my part.
Thank you. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. Okay, so I have just three kind of big pieces to share. The first, I'm going to just talk about what diagnosis is on a really basic level. Then I'm going to share a couple examples of how I teach foundations of diagnosis in art. And then I'll end by talking about art as a very fertile space for the development of human potential. So, and I have to apologize, the next few slides are kind of like gnarly diagrams from academic papers. And please don't worry about trying to understand all of the details of them. I'm just going to hit on some basics. But diagnosis itself is very interesting to me because it is work that subscribes to science principles, and at the same time, it's deeply humanistic and relational work. And as I mentioned before, it's really at the center of the core art of medicine. So when you think about like what a diagnosis is, it's very commonly misunderstood. So it's a diagnosis, there's two definitions to it. So one of them is that it's like that answer to the question of what is causing an unwellness in a person. And that's true. And it's also the process by which you arrive at that answer. This picture of the diagnostic process is a really important one in the medical literature because it really emphasizes that it is a process. And if we think about it as an answer, it can invite like really rushing to get to the right answer, which shortchanges the process, which is very much one of interacting with data and collecting a lot of different perspectives and going back to the patient. And it can shortchange that when we think of it like an answer to rush to, like on a multiple choice test. So the second piece is that we used to kind of think of diagnosis as something that happened, so like in the head of one person, like a really smart person who could read the chart and look at the patient and know the answer. We thought of it as expertise. And of course, expertise is massively, massively important, and we need look no further than Dr. Eckert, who's constantly learning and really leading the forefront of our understanding of the research on their area. But we need that expertise. In fact, we need a lot of expertise across collectives. But now we understand, thanks to the learning sciences and neuroscience and things like situativity theory and distributed mind and these theories, we understand that diagnoses arrive, that answer comes, actually not in the head of any one person, but out in the world. That answer shows up in conversations between people, in correspondences, in interacting with data or the world or people. And so these two foundations, that it's a process and that it happens out in the world, they can actually be very difficult to teach and learn. And especially for people who've performed really well on multiple choice tests, like as many of our medical learners have done very well in school, they're almost at a disadvantage for learning about this relational, interactive, process-based work. And so, interestingly, at the same time, these two foundations actually intersect really beautifully. The same are true of arts experiences and what makes art like reliably magical and surprising when we interact with it. Those same two things are true, and other principles as well. So I'll give you a couple examples of what I mean. This is a painting that hangs in the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, and it's an old narrative painting that's a scene out of Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale. I recently, a few years ago, had the pleasure of looking at it with a group of, an interdisciplinary group of clinicians in Canada. And, you know, when you're looking at it, there's so much you can observe to make out the narrative. You see, like, this figure in the foreground, and I apologize, the reproduction is terrible. It's very hard to find a good reproduction of this, so you have to go to Toronto to see it. But, you know, there's a figure in the foreground. We can see a ship that, you know, appears to have fallen in the background. There's, you know, we just see, like, the force of Mother Nature with this weather and this magnificent, like, vastness. It's a quite large work of art. This is basically the size it is, like a garage door. We see the possibility of hope in the light there. And as viewers, we're kind of like here in the reeds, like in the shadows, kind of peeking in on this scene. And because of, like, the way in which color and dark and light are handled, what you don't see right away is, and it's almost impossible to see in this reproduction. You basically have to go to Canada to see it. But right here in the foreground, there's actually a bear. And even when you're in person with this, it takes a while for your eyes to adjust and for that bear to emerge. So it took us about like 20 minutes as a group of about 15 for that to happen. And so this is there's a lot of different things we could take away from this work of art and from art in general. But coming back to diagnosis, so these diagnostic inquiries, they begin with observations. All interactions begin with seeing the patient. And there are some really important principles of clinical observation that we can understand and appreciate in just that experience. So the first is that clinical observation is goal-oriented. So clinicians are trained to look for signposts of their expertise, you know, signs of the development of this or deficiencies of that or signifiers of this. And that's really great. That's called pattern recognition. Excuse me. It works a lot of the time. It's known to work about 85% of the time. But when all you do is look in a goal-oriented way and you don't stop and you don't pause to look around, to look with the perspectives of other people, to look in a sort of open-ended way, you can miss the bear. You can end up in a tunnel vision that will render you very likely to miss key details like the bear. The second is that observation actually takes time. It's real attentional work to take in a whole picture or a whole patient for that matter. And there's two pieces on this. First, we really very badly need systems that support clinicians in having much more time. And clinicians' workloads are always increasing for productivity and bottom lines, but that boosts in productivity come with boosts in inaccuracy rates. And in fact, taking more time has been shown, you don't really even need science on this, but there is some. It's been shown to boost diagnostic accuracy in gastroenterology, and time pressure has been shown to increase stress and likelihood for error. So we already know this. And so our system designers very badly need to be paying attention to this as we recreate and design new systems. And for clinicians, it also means they need to be really savvy with how they use their time, where they put their attention, how they use technology, and ensuring that technology supports rather than distracts from their attention. So, and actually here's a study from a few years back that showed just clinicians who were prompted to take a pause throughout their day actually made 13% more new actions. Okay, so that's one example. A second example, so this is a work of art that hangs in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And I use it a lot in my teaching, and I really love it because the longer you look at it, the more you see complexity and paradox in a way that's like a lot like real life. Probably a lot more like real life than some of the robots you get in the simulation center at medical schools. Although there is a robot at the Yale Simulation Center that like delivers a baby, which is pretty cool. But the complexity here is really fun. So, when you look at this, some people talk about seeing two people in a very harmonious bond. They look at the streamlines, the streamlines of the fluid, the fluid lines and the way in which their bodies are interwoven like a basket weaving, and seeing sort of peace and harmoniousness. You can also look at this and say, like, wait a minute, there's like limbs being wrenched, and there's some kind of power struggle. It's like the opposite of peace and harmoniousness. There's a struggle here. Likewise, people talk about like, oh, are they wrestling, or are they engaged in some kind of like really active, intimate encounter? And other people talk about like, are they asleep? Are they sound asleep? You can literally see both at the same time. We can look at this as if we're looking at it head on, or we can look at it as if we're gazing down like an aerial view. There's quite a bit of ambiguity with regards to gender, with regards to power dynamics. Is this figure on top in control, or is this figure destabilizing the whole thing? Are they holding on to each other or trying to separate? It just gets more and more and more and more the more you look at it with a diverse group of people. And so this work of art, yes, we see this complexity, right? That's a lot like human complexity. And this work of art is made by an artist, Henri Gautier-Bretzka, in 1914, and it's called The Wrestlers. That's the title that Gautier-Bretzka gave to this work of art. But if I had told you that, or if I had told my medical learners that at the beginning, you wouldn't have seen all of those things, and you wouldn't have actually looked for yourself to make sense of what's there. You would have just accepted what was handed to you, which, many examples we just heard, has a lot of likelihood to be wrong, because it came out of a legacy paradigm that really only supported and benefited the needs of a small part of our population. And so medical learners are, taught to look for what they're told to, and are rarely taught to look for themselves the way in which artists do. And by the way, just because this work of art is called The Wrestlers, I'm not convinced that that's what they are. I think that the artist might have been referring to the idea of wrestling that is undergirding our human relationships in our world, and playing with that. It's not an illustration, right? And so those kinds of errors of thinking that you might fall prey to if I had told you that title are exactly the same kind of errors in thinking that happen all the time, errors large and small in the clinic, and there are many different kinds, but I'll just point out a couple. So we know that stigma, especially stigmatizing language, this difficult patient, this alcoholic, this drug abuser, things like that, they stick like flypaper in the words that are chosen to describe a person and their situation, stay in the record and have a long ripple effect in the subsequent providers and how those people perceive and treat those patients. It's a lot like actually what happened to my own sister, who as a kid received all kinds of labels as a result of her gender and her disability that caused her entire teenage years to be awash in medications for very serious mental health disorders that she didn't have. And it was only in her 20s that she was diagnosed by a state social worker and a nurse as having Asperger's. So she received a lot of treatments that were totally costly and harmful and not necessary. as a result of those kinds of framing errors. There are many, many, many different ways to rush to conclusions. We have a lot of different kinds of biases that we fall prey to all the time. And we're not bad people for having biases and falling prey to errors. It's actually natural, normal function of how our brains work to save energy. But in a clinical setting, if thinking goes unchecked, and there's a mismatch between words chosen and what is actually there, it can lead to all kinds of devastation. And this ranges from clinical error to just outright discrimination that has massive public health effects on a very big scale. These same kinds of skills, being able to simply describe what you see accurately and having the self-awareness to know that what you see is often more subjective than you think, and rather than using inferencing language, using facts to back up those inferences, those are exactly the same capacities that we found medical learners were able to develop in an arts intervention. This is as part of a course I was involved in at Harvard Medical School. Those same observation skills, and we found that students who participated in an art class that was 7 or more sessions long were able to make much more accurate and precise and robust descriptions of pictures of patients. And this study is just one in a whole series and growing body of literature from the health humanities, which in fact actually has very deep roots here in New Haven, indicating some very important links between arts experiences and clinical cognition. And so I'll just end by talking about art itself and the really sort of wily and surprising ways in which it works and which it engages our capacities in process and relational and understanding our world better. So works of art, they invite us to make sense of them on a sensory level. So here we see like music, and we see food and things that smell beautiful, and color. They tell a story, often in a lot of different and unexpected ways. Works of art show us the full spectrum of our humanity, and they often break the stereotypes, the very damaging stereotypes that we see in the media that are at the root of a lot of misunderstandings. And there's a lot of research on bias prevention and debiasing, and actually a lot of those interventions are shown to not work. But one thing that is shown to work is the use of counter-stereotypic images to slow people down and shatter their beliefs. Works of art take us back to our deep, deep, deep roots, and they remind us that our stories are timeless as well as of the times. And they remind us of a much bigger picture of belonging to a big, big beloved human family. And as I mentioned before, they can offer us opportunities where one detail, often discovered through the perspective of someone we thought we knew who surprised us, can change everything. And so I'll just end by mentioning that when we make sense of works of art, we engage our aesthetic intelligence. And that's a very deep form of knowledge that is comes from a felt knowledge place, is a pre-language place, a place where what we see, our observing and our listening and our touch and our taste is really one and the same. And it's that same kind of deep listening, the kind so deep that you are forever changed, that is at the core of diagnosis and excellent clinical practice. It's at the core of healing as much of it is in connection, as much as research and scientific discovery. The poet Susan Stewart has this beautiful quote. She talks about how listening is touch at a distance. And as we look ahead into a very dynamic and uncertain future, It's the clinicians who are the most in touch with patients and the needs of communities who will have an extremely important role to play. So thank you so much for joining our panel tonight on the art of seeing, and we will now have our Q&A. Hi. Actually, so to begin, could we actually have our slides back up? So we wanted to start by asking each other the same question. So let's start with you, Dr. Eckert. What's a work of art? You know, we've been talking about a lot of very important and also very heavy things. And so just to kind of flip it a little bit, what's a work of art that brings you joy?
Let me see. Oh, we got the pointer. Okay. So,
One more. There you go.
There we go. All right. So, I'm a huge horror fan. You might be able to tell by my tattoos, my shirt, but for me, I really like the intersection of queerness and horror, and that's why horror has always meant so much to me. Like, since I was a kid, I always kind of found the queer in horror, and I think it's really there. It's one of those genres that's very subversive, and a lot of it is about monsters and like vampires and creatures in the night, and you know, you end up as someone who is queer kind of associating with those characters and feeling that otherness and kind of living vicariously through those stories. This is from Phantom of the Paradise, which is a movie not a lot of people know about. Came out a year before Rocky Horror Picture Show. This is Beef, who's probably one of my favorite characters ever. I have a tattoo of him as well. Yeah, he's very much like Dr. Frankenfurter, if you know Rocky Horror Picture Show. Very queer character, and yeah, I just really resonate with kind of that intersection of queerness and horror. It's art that means a lot to me. It's kind of my comfort, so that's what I figured I would show.
Thank you. That's awesome.
So, same question to you.
Well, now after hearing that, I just want to talk about all the TV shows that helped me survive middle school. But I brought, so I really love this. It's very hard for me to choose a favorite work of art, but coming back to joy, there's so many different kinds of joys and pleasures. But this one, I saw very recently, right before the pandemic, I came across it at the Brooklyn Museum in the room with the mummies. And it just really stops me in my tracks because it's there's so much grace and sensitivity in the carving. This is like stone, carving into stone that's like thousands of years old. And there's so much tenderness in it. And I read about it a little bit and discovered that it's a fragment of a bigger piece that shows two people who were fighting a war together. And one of them is fallen and is going to die. And it shows like the love between friends and the love, like the idea of comrades. And, you know, I think at the end of the day, like that's the love that really truly matters and actually has a lot of power to redesign our world if we can have more of it. But I also just think it's incredibly beautiful. Actually, I wondered if we could go back to, you were talking about your patients and the stress that many of them carry, and I wondered if you could actually talk more about health itself and like what it means to you and how you understand health on a basic level. And I'd love to hear you talk about that, and then maybe a little bit more on the impact of stress and violence and bullying on health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess I bring my own perspective to health. I mean, certainly growing up being who I am, I wasn't someone who was a fan of going to the doctor. I found myself being mistreated and underdiagnosed and asked really insulting questions a lot. I certainly never thought I'd end up in this career. And I think that a lot of what we try to do in our practice is make sure we're meeting the patients at like where they are and understanding that they're coming in and maybe really not wanting to see a doctor. Most of them have had bad past experiences with healthcare providers. I mean, it's almost surprising to me when they haven't. So the goal really for me is to listen and hopefully have us model the kind of doctors that we would have wanted to see, you know, that I would have wanted to go to and talk to and actually feel like I'm being seen, you know, for who I am. So I think our community, and by that I mean like the LGBTQ community and specifically the trans community, is incredibly underserved in a lot of ways. So first of all, you have to find the right doctor to go to that you feel comfortable talking to. And I can tell you even now, if I have to go see a specialist, someone I don't know, or be, you know, out in a public space like that, like a healthcare setting where people don't know me, I am completely afraid of being misgendered. It happens all the time. It's not something you can prepare for. It's something that you can either like shrug off and get through the day with, or it's something that happens in a more kind of malicious way where people are looking at your chart and they clearly see what your name is and what your pronouns are and they choose not to use that. Unfortunately, I see that happening with my patients a lot of the time as well when we send them to, or when they go to the ER or see a specialist. So that's a big part of, I think, our job in healthcare is really understanding our patient populations and being able to see everybody, not just who we think we should, who we're comfortable seeing with. So we also get referrals from primary care doctors, and I'm a primary care doctor. That's my training. Obviously, I do this. This is my kind of specialty, although it doesn't exist as a specialty in medicine. We've built that to be what it is. So as a primary care doctor, you really need to be comfortable with seeing every kind of patient. And a lot of times I get referrals from a patient's primary care doctor once they've disclosed that they're trans, because that doctor now says, well, I don't know what to do with you. I don't know how to treat you. You're going to have to teach me about this. And that's never a patient's job. Obviously, like as a doctor, your role is to listen to your patient, but your patient isn't there to educate you. And I've far too many times had the experience of having a patient tell me, oh yeah, no, my old doctor, I had to tell them exactly what to do with me. And even down to if they wanted to be on hormones, you know, what kind of hormones to use. And I had to bring the studies to my doctor. That's never okay. I just find that to be unconscionable. So part of my mission is really to make sure that all doctors are comfortable, you know, seeing our population, seeing, you know, historically, you know, minoritized and marginalized communities. Yeah, so to me, I mean, that really encompasses a big part of what healthcare is and health can mean.
Yeah. I just want to say thank you for your work. You talked about primary care physicians. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the pediatricians who are out there, and is that a part of your advocacy and education work, educating clinicians who are caring for very young children? And could you talk about things that they need to know, they need to be able to recognize, and if you're comfortable with it, and no worries if you're not, like some of the patterns of harm that we also need to be able to recognize that they're doing, and they're traumatizing people in the clinic?
Yeah, so I am a family practice, you know, doctor, because I also do enjoy seeing kids. So I always wanted to be able to see both, you know, adults and children. So yes, especially trans youth are kind of my wheelhouse when I'm doing research and when I'm, you know, preparing articles and things like that, especially with how targeted they are and have been in the last couple of years. So I think that for pediatricians, it's really important to know that if a child comes in and tells you that they are, you know, trans or non-binary, otherwise gender diverse, then it's really important to listen to them, to affirm them in that identity, because children know. I mean, cisgender children know just as well as transgender children. You know, gender identity starts to develop around age 2. You know, it's not necessarily, it can be something that's fluid, but children understand the concepts of who they are. Even those that are raised to be cisgender understand themselves as being transgender. So, I mean, I think that there needs to be overall less gatekeeping when it comes to medical care. Of course, when we're talking about children, there's no medical intervention until they've reached puberty. But the way pediatricians, you know, can best support children is to pay attention, listen to them, affirm them, you know, help them with any kind of social kind of affirmation they may want to do, whether it's helping them come out at school, helping them enforce their correct name and pronouns, and then just making sure that they're being open-minded and not doing the kind of, you know, very damaging questioning that happens a lot of times in the healthcare field. Especially trans people have been just medically pathologized since the beginning of any kind of transgender healthcare work. So it's important to try to break those patterns. And unfortunately, I see the gatekeeping that still happens to this day, where people have to prove themselves. They have to prove, like, I'm trans enough to be able to access this kind of care. And that's, I don't even have a good word for that. The fact that anybody would have to prove who they are is just, it's baffling to me. And it's really, really damaging. I mean, we see the improvements that people have when they are supported in who they are. And that doesn't mean just medically, that means supported by their parents. You know, trans youth have a remarkably reduced suicide rate and rate of suicidal ideation when they have supportive family structures, or when they can go talk to a professional who is going to affirm them. There's lower rates of depression, anxiety, all of that. And if we can kind of start affirming people when they are young, you know, we can potentially avoid having adults who have been now traumatized by the medical system to the point that they have, you know, serious anxiety and depression and PTSD and things that we are seeing really on a daily basis. So.
There's so much there I want to unpack, but I actually want to ask you to expand a little bit on how you reach parents, especially with very small children, knowing that, you know, of course, the pediatrician is really important, but how can you or the pediatrician coach the parents? Like, are they all in the same room? Just knowing how damaging it can be when parents don't believe their child or accept their child as who they are. How do you do, in the role of that in children's health, how do you do that piece? Or what needs to happen?
What needs to happen?
You personally?
So when we see youth in the clinic, the parents have already made the step to come in, at least be open to the idea of supporting their child through whatever affirmation steps they can do at the time. So we're not really seeing the population that are denying the care, you know. So then really I think the important piece is educating the providers that are going to be seeing that child. So again, like making sure that pediatricians are aware of the way that trans youth are being targeted out in the media and are aware of what's happening in the mainstream and know ways to combat that. Like when they're asked questions, know how to answer them. You know, if somebody brings up, what about rapid onset gender dysphoria? Well, it's not a real diagnosis, not a real thing. It's incredibly problematic. You know, just being able to stay on top of the news and the research that's out there. And, you know, certainly we can't tap into all of those populations, but part of it too with what we do with social media is try to reach those kids who maybe don't have access to a clinic, who can watch a video on TikTok. You know, a lot of my kids come in saying, like, you know, I've been watching YouTube videos and I've been doing that for years, and that's really helped me figure out who I am, and you know, and helped me to see the role models out there that really weren't there for my generation. You know, and I think that part of what needs to happen is just to keep building awareness and keep countering the narratives that really kind of predominantly overtake, especially the mainstream. You know, people want to set up that there's some sort of argument out there between what's right for trans youth, whether it's gender-affirming care or it's essentially conversion therapy, because anything where you're saying like, well, no, you're wrong, you can't possibly know right now, is a form of telling them, you know, denying them and saying like, I'll believe you at a certain age, at a certain arbitrary age. We can talk about this again. That's very damaging.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's just continuing to educate and push out the information as much as possible so we can counter some of those narratives. For every, you know, good scientific review that comes out, there's 99, you know, fake fear-mongering you know, news articles and papers that come out. So it's really hard, but we just have to build on just continually educating people, get more people into positions such as the healthcare field and research fields that are trans, that are LGBTQ, who can also, you know, help counter those narratives. That said, we have to make those fields more accessible for people like me to be able to get through. I know for me, medical school residency was like 8 years of hazing. It was incredibly tough. I didn't think I would make it through. I got very suicidal during and after, and a lot of that had to do with my queer identity. So systems change. But I will ask you now, since
Sure. Can I ask you one more question?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
There's so much you just said that I want to ask more about, but I do want to know, like, what's your favorite part of your job? Like the best part, like the part that's like, this is the best part.
That's really hard. I mean, I kind of do love all of it. There's like joy in every part of it. So there's really so much joy in the clinical encounters I have with patients. But I really like the education piece as well. Like, and I like to be able to have the time to kind of do the research and keep up on the information and know how to especially counter things that are out there in the media. So definitely the clinical encounters, but a big piece is being able to, like, very subtly in a science-based and evidence-based manner, clap back at some of the worst trolls that are out there. So when we put out articles that are essentially like saying, no, you're wrong about this and this is why, and I can back it up with all sorts of evidence, that gives me like extreme joy.
Thank you.
So what is the intersection of arts and humanities with patient care? Like,
Oh my goodness. So I guess I'm very like up close to that. So I would say like there's so many different ones. And I couldn't possibly name them all, but I'll name a few. Like there's what I do, which is about how to see, right? There's also things like playing music, you know, like clinicians together with patients or clinicians together with other clinicians, like for mental health and for enjoyment, and to speak to aspects of medicine that they're experiencing all the time and can't always like reflect on, but like to sort of take that pause and like look with awe at like how big life is. There's things like taking dementia patients to an art museum and watching them reclaim memories and language, like through the associations of what they see. And there's really incredible research on how that reminiscence work and how it really brings people back to life. There's a lot. And then of course there's like all the topics of, you know, understanding different aspects of humanity and like human situations and the ethics of it that, you know, we can be confronted with in works of art, in literature, in film, in poetry. There's encountering art, there's making art. So it's a huge world, and you know, there's a lot of just really incredible stuff. You know, and one place I might be different from some of that world is that, like, as much as I'm for the arts and humanities, that's been like my sort of pathway up the mountain. But like my work is, at the end of the day, it's not about promoting art experiences. It's about improving accuracy and progress, and, you know, deeply believing in the beautiful concept of the equality of all souls and restoring that in medicine. And art has been a very powerful way for me to explore that and teach with it and learn as I go. But at the end of the day, it's actually not about the art as much as the art is very critical.
And we talked a little bit about training, you know, healthcare professionals. So what is the role of art and the humanities in that?
In training specifically, I think, you know, I think it's really important that, you know, like, I'm talking about medical students. I'm not going to talk about like nursing and social work. There's a lot of different like paths, but medical students are really drilled. It's really drilled out of them to like have a life outside of their work, and they're trained, they're rewarded for like not needing sleep, for not needing to go to the bathroom, being able to stay 12 hours in a surgery without having to pee. They're rewarded for not needing to eat lunch, like literally for cutting themselves off from their body signals. And in the sort of spirit of trying to like master all of this information, can detach to such an extent that they really cut off from their own humanity. And so, you know, I don't necessarily think the answer to that is art. I think the answer to that is like human respect and experience. But art can serve as a very humbling reminder of some of those things, and be a place to, you know, even outside of the curriculum, simply to restore oneself and have other interests and other parts of your life that are really important. Like you, I mean, you're a pianist, is that correct?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I
Yeah.
agree with that. You know, I one of the first things that I had to do when I started medical school was get a piano, because I needed something outside of just having to study so many hours during the day and having to like do all this work that it was just overwhelming. I mean, it's nothing like I didn't feel prepared for it after college. You know, it felt like really easy, and then suddenly like, oh no, now I have to study for things. And so having that piece of, for me, like meditation and be able to kind of reset, you know, like for me has always been piano. So I'm classically trained, I mean, but now I kind of play for fun, and I've been doing that since med school because it's a good way to have that kind of balance too, and to support myself. So
Fun is really important.
agreed, yeah.
Oh my goodness, we should probably turn it over to the audience for questions. I believe we have somebody monitoring the online space, and there's, I can kind of see out in the crowd. If people have questions, you can raise your hand. Yeah. Sure, in the front, yes? Oh, yes, thank you.
I'll repeat your question, otherwise. I'll say it. Okay. So the picture of the wrestlers, and you know, all of the different ways that you can see or interpret that picture. And so I just wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about the uncertainty that kind of brings up, because I think that when you open yourself up to being able to see all of these different ways or the inputs, then how do we get comfortable with that uncertainty as well? Because I can imagine that, you know, as the care providers and as people who want to support other folks, that there's a fear that comes up, because that's exactly when you want to get to the answer.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'll have some thoughts on that. I'm sure you have thoughts on that as well. I can start. So what you're pinpointing in is extremely important, and I've actually had the opportunity to study like very masterful clinicians, and the way in which they respond to uncertainty is very, very different from the standard fair norm practice, and it's critical. And there's so much shaming in academia and in these programs for not knowing the answer. And people are actually traumatized from that too. And and then there's defensive practice. They're supposed to lead with their expertise. Like, I'm the doctor, so I'm the smart one, I know. But, they might not. And then there's all this legal, insurance and litigation, so there's defensive practice. So it's a truly horrible bind. And I have a lot of compassion for the clinicians in that spot. And also, you want to help the patient. You need to do something. You don't necessarily have time to have a humanities conversation. But the real trick is to be compassionate to yourself and be able to stay calm in uncertainty, and to not let fear or preconceived knowledge cloud what you're seeing, and to know that it is okay there's many different ways of saying I don't know. And often patients, especially those with complex cases, would much rather are relieved to hear the clinician is, I don't know, but we're going to stick together and we're going to figure this out, and we're going to do this and this and this. I'm not sure, but I'm going to think aloud about these 3 things that I think it might be, and that's going to help educate you, and we're going to move together through this not knowing with a strengthened relationship, and with clear-mindedness and rationality, and find the right other people to bring into the picture. That's very different from saying I don't know. But it's a really critical lever in the difference between quality and when care becomes harmful. Mm-hmm. And also, it's a difference between co-creating health with a patient. The role of the clinician is supporting the patient in their journey, versus using that expertise to have power over them, or to confirm one's own sense of expertise. And that's known to be very dangerous. I mean, one of the things I appreciate the most about the diagnostic error literature is that it shows us that authentic uncertainty is much safer than false certainty.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. I think that the area of medicine that I practice in has a lot of uncertainty in it, and that's because there are such huge gaps in the research, and there's a lot that we're still learning, and luckily better research is coming out now. But I definitely think that patients respond better to, I'm not sure, but I'm going to take some time to look this up and see what research is out there. Mm-hmm. And things like, well, actually, here is what we do know, here is what we don't know, because that's often the case. So mm-hmm. Here's the research that says X is likely, here's the research that says actually maybe not, and so that you have all the information. Because I really think being transparent with our patients is very important. Have them, like you said, be kind of part of their own, empower them to be part of their mm-hmm. own, health journey, and give them the information that's required in order to do that. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's much better to say, I don't know, but I'm going to look into this for you, because then people feel more listened to and cared for as well. Mm-hmm.
Online questions. According to the US Trans Survey and other needs assessments, data collection of LGBTQ identities is really needed. In your opinion, what areas of data collection are most needed at this time?
All of them. So, unfortunately, we have some estimates on kind of the overall U.S. surveys that give us an idea of our population size, but it's really just an estimate, because there are so many reasons that LGBTQ people might not disclose who they are on a survey. Fear of stigma, fear of discrimination. So a lot of times we're not capturing those populations. There's also the problem that a lot of the surveys only look at binary population, so they'll look at trans people, but they don't look at non-binary trans people, so we're missing a whole subset of people there. There really needs to be kind of improvement all over, in gathering information and research, and for that gap to close, we need funding, we need people who are interested in doing the work, and really, we need to have the public, want to do this research and have us be part of that research. So yeah, there's a lot of gaps that need to be filled, and where I don't know that the estimates we have now on our population size, on our healthcare disparities, is anywhere close to accurate, just because we've historically missed so many of us in those studies.
And the second question is, how do you first guide medical learners to bring this skill of open observation into the exam room? What are the practical steps to begin this process?
That's a great question. I've had the opportunity to work with some really excellent teachers of diagnosis in different domains. And I should mention that all of my teaching is really co-teaching with medical professionals. And so it's a conversation across disciplines. But what I've seen work so well, and I learned this from Dr. Joel Katz at Harvard Medical School, was simply to actually take medical learners into the wards and take them on rounds, not for the kinds of rounds where they have to like act like they know and like diagnose the patient, but actually simply to observe and to avoid diagnostic language, but to really simply like describe what they see, to ask the patient permission to be engaged with in that way, and then to hear the patient's story. And I did that for 10 years in a program at Harvard Medical School, and every single time the patient would thank the medical learners for doing that and say, I might not be here stuck in this bed if somebody had done that sooner. And the medical learners often felt awkward, like, oh, I'm being rude, or I should really just look at the chart. It's like there's barriers that they need to, cultural barriers that they need to get over. And it's very simple things like close the door for the person's dignity, and so that you can hear them. Turn on the light so you can really see, and look at the environment, and just take that time. So I'd say that's really essential. And in general, too, even if you can't go on rounds, to constantly be making links back between what happened in the arts experience and very specific cases in medicine, if you're using pictures or stories. So that's where I would recommend starting. I want to respect people's time because I think we're over. I'm happy to stay and go all night, but I do believe we're over the hour. Unless there are any urgent, burning last questions. Well, thank you so much. And Dr. Eckert, thank you so much for this conversation and for your work in the world. I'm so glad we had the opportunity to meet.
Same. Thank you, Alexa.
Yeah.
This is a really interesting conversation. So,
Thank you all.